Your clothes are technically still on your body. That's the good news. The bad news is that they've fused with your skin sometime during the last rainstorm. You peel the fabric from your shoulder and wince. It's damp, itchy, and smells like someone wrung out a swamp frog over it. Twice. You're wearing one outfit, just one. A single set of coarse hemp robes, which you rotate between wet, still wet, and mysteriously wet again. There is no dry. Dry is a fable the elders whisper about between coughs. The color used to be brown, or maybe gray. Now it's just flood shade. The cloth is stiff with dried mud and rice starch, and it rubs you raw under the arms. You try not to move too fast. Chafing is your new religion. You have no socks. You have no underwear. You did have a belt, made of braided reeds, but the river took it. Now you're using twine that used to bind vegetables, fashion forward and biodegradable. Your shoes, if they can still be called that, are two wooden soles tied to your feet with bits of string. On rainy days, they float. On other days, they vanish in the muck. You walk barefoot half the time, carefully avoiding splinters, shattered roof tiles, and the occasional fish carcass flung in from the upstream village. Inside, your sleeves live things. Lice, mostly. But also the occasional flea and a mysterious beetle you've named Lao Zhang. You've tried picking them off, but they always return. It's less a hygiene problem and more a you've become a mobile habitat situation. Washing your clothes sounds like a good idea until you realize there's nowhere clean to wash them. The floodwater is brown, opaque, and full of floating objects that are probably illegal to identify. Soap exists, technically, but you'd have to trade half your food rations for a lump the size of your thumb. Instead, you let your clothes sit in a bucket for an hour, hoping the water scares the lice into migrating. Sometimes it works. Mostly. It just makes them angry. The government once issued silk garments to war heroes. You are not one of them. You saw a tax officer wearing silk last week, though it shimmered in the sun like betrayal. You fantasized about wrapping it around his smug face until the shine went out. Historians still argue whether Song peasant clothing was more of a protection or a punishment, some academic noted, probably while wearing 3 layers of clean linen. You hope his ink pot spilled. You once tied dried reeds to your ankles to try and stay warmer at night. You look like a rice scarecrow. A neighbor offered you a fishbone necklace in exchange for a spare tunic. You don't own a spare tunic. You don't even own a spare sleeve. Your hat, a conical straw affair, collapsed during the second week of flooding. You tried patching it with rice paper. It now functions as a very honest colander. Still, you wear your robes like armor, frayed and faded. They mark you as one of the many, one of the floodborn. A little waterlogged, a little chewed on, but not yet gone. You scratch the back of your neck. Something wiggles. You sigh and flick it away. Just another day in your Song Dynasty fashion week. Spoiler, everyone's wearing the same thing, and lice are the accessory of the season. Your mouth feels like it's lined with old rice husks. You run your tongue over your teeth, those that are still there, and it catches on something sharp. Probably not enamel, possibly a splinter, from your own molar. Dental hygiene, you'll be relieved to know, is very simple in the Song Dynasty. Mostly because it doesn't exist. There are no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss, just your finger, and whatever optimism you can summon. Occasionally, a wandering herbalist sells tooth-cleaning sticks, chewed ends of aromatic twigs. You tried one once. It tasted like sadness dipped in vinegar. Still, it felt better than your usual method, spitting into a rice bowl and hoping the cavity gods show mercy. Your breath is not great. a potent blend of fermented millet, swamp water, and slowly dying molars. Children cry when you lean in. Ducks waddle away. You once woke up to find a snail had crawled into your open mouth overnight and left again. Historians still argue whether Song peasants suffered more from starvation or tooth pain. Based on the sharp throb in your jaw right now, you're leaning toward the latter. A rotten incisor has been pulsating like a cursed gong for 3 days straight. You can't chew anything harder than steamed yam. Even that feels like betrayal. There are no dentists in your village. The closest thing is old Wu, the blacksmith, who once offered to pull a tooth using iron tongs and a prayer. Payment required a chicken. You didn't have a chicken, so you offered a gourd. He laughed. Then used the gourd to fix a hole in his roof. Sometimes monks chant over aching mouths. It doesn't help the teeth, but it does drown out the screams. When the pain gets really bad, you suck on salt if you have any, or hot ash, or bite a coin. Not for relief, just to distract yourself. Your gums bleed every morning. You rinse with rice wine when you can, which is like setting your nerves on fire to scare off the rats. Effective, in a way. You've seen what happens to untreated mouths. The neighbor's grandmother lost half her jaw to something they call wind tooth. No one knows what it is. Everyone knows it hurts. Her face collapsed inward like a rotten peach. She still grins, somehow. A traveling physician once claimed that bad teeth came from imbalanced humors and offered leeches. You didn't try that, but your cousin did. And now he speaks with a whistle. There are rumors that high-ranking officials chew on a powder made of crushed pearl. You wonder what it's like to have pearls, or molars that don't resemble tree bark. Every now and then, someone dies from tooth fever. A simple abscess turns into an infection, which turns into delirium, which turns into, he's gone now. The village simply shrugs. Another mouthless mouth to feed. You try not to think about your next meal. It might involve chewing. That's a gamble you're not ready for. Instead, you lie back on your reed mat, pressing a warm brick to your cheek. And imagine a world where you can bite into an apple without screaming. You've never seen an apple, but you're told they're crunchy. Right now, you'd settle for something you can gum to death without waking the neighbors. The rooster doesn't crow. He drowned 2 days ago. You wake not to bird song, but to the sound of water sloshing under your mat again. It's back. The flood that was supposed to recede has returned, because of course it has. The river and the sky are still having a very loud argument, and you are the soggy collateral damage. You peel yourself off the damp reed mat like an old dumpling stuck to bamboo. Your back aches. Your knees protest. You're 25, but your joints firmly believe you're 87. Another glorious workday begins. Your job, moving mud, lifting stones, repairing a dike that will almost certainly collapse again tomorrow. You'd think flood defense would involve at least a shovel, but no. You get a basket, your hands, and a sense of existential despair. The water never lets you forget who's in charge. You trudge through knee-high sludge to reach the embankment, only to be met by government soldiers shouting at you to go faster. One of them is 14. He has a sword and no visible sense of humor. Historians still argue whether the Song Dynasty's elaborate bureaucracy helped or hindered disaster relief. You, personally, have an opinion, especially after being told to fill out a bamboo slip documenting your daily output in liters of mud. Labor is unpaid. Technically, it's corvée service. A tax in the form of broken spines and back injuries. You once tried to fake an injury by limping. Then you got kicked in the actual leg. So now you limp authentically. Your arms are raw from hauling wet sand. Your hands are blistered. You smell like a drowned ox. And that's before lunch. If you're a woman, congratulations, you get double duty. You carry rocks by day, cook millet mush at dusk, and rock a screaming toddler while praying the roof doesn't leak more tonight. It will. If you're a child, welcome to the workforce. At age 6, you can carry bricks. By 10, you can thatch a roof. And by 12, you understand that dreams are just things you used to have before the harvest failed. The tools are basic. Baskets woven from cane, poles carved from split bamboo. No pulleys, no wheels, just your shoulders and the vague hope that someone remembers your name if the levee breaks. Your cousin tried to escape the labor by pretending to be a scholar. He quoted Confucius to the foreman and was immediately assigned to latrine duty. Now he writes poems about dung. Sometimes, if you're lucky, the local magistrate visits to supervise. He arrives on a boat with a red parasol and fresh fruit. You haven't seen fruit in weeks. He gives a short speech about resilience and leaves before his feet touch the mud. A local legend says a carp once jumped into a worker's bucket and sang a folk song before leaping back into the river. That was 3 floods ago, and no one's heard the song since. You dream of rest, but even sleep requires energy, and your body is a wet sack of noodles trying to impersonate a human. You stagger home as dusk bleeds into night. Your hut is slightly tilted now. One corner has sunk. You don't fix it. You just tilt with it. No rest days. No breaks. Only the relentless loop of toil, rot, and gray water. And in the distance, thunder. Sleep comes like a drunk house guest late, loud, and likely to steal your blanket. You drift off on your damp mat, vaguely aware of a mosquito trying to reenact the battle of red cliffs on your cheek. When morning arrives, it does so with a blast of humid breath and a leaking roof. Summer in flood season is not just hot, it's aggressively wet and insulting. Your walls sweat. Your skin never dries. You've lived so long in mildew, you start to think maybe you are mildew. Even the bamboo tries to escape itself by cracking open in protest. Your shirt, your only shirt, is a wet rag glued to your spine. It hasn't been dry since the 2nd month of rains. You hang it up at night, not to dry it, but to at least negotiate terms with the mold colony forming in the armpits. Houses in this era, oh, they're charmingly designed death traps. Thin wood planks, thatch, maybe a little clay if you're lucky. Insulation, absolutely not. Windows optional. Ventilation, mostly through holes the rats chewed last week. The result? A sauna in July, an icebox in January, and a wind tunnel whenever your neighbor sneezes. And you can't escape outside, either. The streets are a bubbling soup of heat, mud, and the occasional floating duck carcass. You once saw a toad try to sit in the shade, then give up and crawl into a basket. You understood it deeply. Historians still debate how much climate patterns influenced migration during the Song Dynasty. You debate whether you can migrate from your bed to the water jar without passing out from heat stroke. Now, let's fast forward to winter, because yes, the Song Dynasty flood year doesn't just flood it, freezes later. You know, for variety. Winter arrives with the softness of a hammer. There's no central heating, no portable heaters, just wind that whistles through your shack like it's auditioning for an opera. You sleep curled up like a terrified shrimp, huddled under a straw mat, hoping frostbite only wants your toes today. Your breath fogs the inside of the room. Your hair freezes while you try to light the stove. In that stove, it's fueled by bits of rotten wood and prayer. Remember your clothes, same ones from summer. Only now they're stiff, itchy, and contain what you assume are 5 different species of louse. You try layering shirt, then a rice sack with holes, but layering doesn't help when both layers are damp and made of things not meant to touch human skin. You used to complain about sweating in summer. Now you complain about shivering in winter. Soon, you'll learn to miss sweating. That's the Song Dynasty experience, nostalgic for misery you hated just a few months ago. Snow falls. You try to catch it on your tongue because it might be the cleanest water you'll taste all week. Then it hits the thatch and slides straight through the roof onto your face. It's refreshing. Your fingers turn gray. Your feet feel like stones. You remember someone saying warm rice wine helps. You also remember you can't afford rice wine. You survive by clinging to heat like a greedy cat. You press against other bodies, siblings, parents, neighbors. Privacy is a summer concept. In winter, it's warmth or death, mostly both. A rumor spreads the governor's manor has real silk blankets and heated bricks for their feet. You imagine that scene like it's heaven. Then you sneeze and get scolded because if you're sick. No one wants your breath near the last half-dry piece of firewood. You survive, barely, but the weather always wins. It's the emperor you never voted for and the tax collector who never leaves. By now, you've grown used to discomfort. It's your closest friend, possibly the only one who doesn't leave when the floods come. But there's one thing you still haven't made peace with water. You know, that thing your body supposedly needs to live. In a Song Dynasty flood year, it's also the thing most likely to kill you. Here's the paradox: there's water everywhere, but you still can't drink it. The rivers are swollen, brown, foamy, and full of things that shouldn't be in water, like shoes, rats, and bits of your neighbor's roof. It flows through villages like it owns the place, knocking down bridges, uprooting trees, and spreading diseases with the cheerful speed of a gossiping auntie. The well in your village has been contaminated since the 3rd week of the floods. Everyone still uses it. Of course. Why? Because that's the cleanest option. You boil what you can, but boiling takes fuel, and fuel takes money or luck, or a willingness to rob your own roof that you already regret building. And when you do drink unboiled water, congratulations, you're now hosting a family of parasites in your intestines. They didn't ask, but they also didn't need to. They just moved in. Historians still argue whether waterborne disease or famine killed more people in flood years. You stop caring as soon as you feel the first cramp. Then there's bathing. Bathing is theater. It's spectacle. It's an act you perform once every 10 days, maybe. You heat water in a giant wok. Mix in a little mint leaf if you're feeling fancy. Then stand behind a thin bamboo screen while your entire household tries not to peek. But here's the trick. Bathing is dangerous. It's believed to open your skin's pores, your sacred body gates to the spirits of disease. So you keep your baths quick, lukewarm, and rare. You wash your hair once a month. If that, you wash your feet when they start to smell like they've been fermenting. Public bathhouses exist for the wealthy. You, meanwhile, clean yourself with a wet rag, a bit of rice husk ash, and the power of imagination. Toilet paper. That's a wild fantasy. You use leaves, sticks, old paper if you're lucky. One time you used bark. You still remember that bark. And so, water becomes your enemy. It seeps through your home, your clothes, your body. It's a vehicle for cholera, dysentery, worms, and rot. Even rain is suspect if it's falling. It's reminding you that your roof is a joke. Your dreams are haunted by both thirst and drowning. You crave a clean sip and fear every drop. You fantasize about a hot bath, but only if it doesn't kill you. And yet, somehow. You keep going. You get up. You scoop another pot of water. You whisper to it, hoping today it's just water. No spirits. No death. The rain has slowed now, reduced to a hush that barely ripples the surface of the flooded patties beyond your broken door. The sky hangs low, a shade of tired gray, as if it too has wept too long. You sit there, knees pulled close, the smell of mildew clinging to your sleeves, the ache of hunger replaced by the duller ache of simply enduring. And still, you're here. Your roof leaks. Your rice stores are moldy. Your neighbors have vanished or turned inward or simply stopped speaking. But you are still breathing in a world that seems determined to wash itself away. You close your eyes for a moment, not to sleep, not quite, but to imagine a different sound. Maybe a dry breeze through bamboo. Maybe laughter that isn't nervous. Maybe silence that doesn't mean someone just drowned. In the distance, a single frog croaks. Life, stubborn and absurd, continues. So let your breath settle. Let your shoulders drop just slightly. Let the floodwaters carry away the day, not your spirit. Song Dynasty has tested you with every drop. But you, somehow, are still afloat. Drift there for a while, and when you're ready, sleep. Hey guys. Tonight, we are drifting back nearly 1,000 years right into the middle of a flood. So biblical, it makes your bathtub seem like a luxury yacht. It's 1126. The Song Dynasty is in full swing, and the Huai River has decided to pay an uninvited visit to your rice paddy, your courtyard, and, unfortunately, your bedroom. You wake up not in a bed, but on a vaguely damp mat of woven reeds that's been absorbing the river's mood swings all night. There's no sunrise today, just a thick gray sky drooling steadily into your world. The good news, you're alive, sort of dry, and not currently being swept downstream. The bad news, your home is now part of the river system. Your rice is fermenting in a soup of regret. And you haven't felt warmth since your last fever broke. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your local time and where you're watching from. I promise I'll try not to send a flood your way. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink the water out of your eyes and roll off your mat. Your back cracks like an old bamboo door. The straw bedding you sleep on has merged with the floor, and you're not entirely sure where your blanket ends and the moss begins. A rat scurries by with more confidence than you'll feel all day. You sit up into the smell of damp wood, boiled rice mold, and chicken droppings. Because yes, you share your home with both your family and your food supply, alive or otherwise. The Song Dynasty was famous for many things: art, poetry, porcelain. But you're famous for waking up in a puddle and wondering if it's rainwater, river water, or neighbor's toilet water. Historians still argue whether the mass relocation plans during the Great Huai Flood were intentional evacuation strategies or just wishful thinking, written in ink that bled in the rain. You nudge aside a sleeping sibling with your elbow. He grumbles, turns over, and wraps his arm around the family duck. There is no privacy here. The room is divided only by hopes and the occasional curtain made from repurposed fishing net. The roof leaks in exactly 7 places, each one precisely above a sleeping body. It's a mystery how it knows. Your first task, empty your sleeping mat of yesterday's rainfall. You lift it, dump the contents out the doorway, and watch it join a line of similar offerings, every doorstep in the village dripping like a nose in flu season. You once dreamed of a better life. Now, you dream of dryness. Outside, the water level has crept up again. The top step of your front stoop is now the only step. Yesterday, your grandmother fell in and declared she was part carp now. You laugh, then feel a pang of guilt. Because honestly, she's been faring better than you. The chickens float in a wooden crate. The pigs have been moved to higher ground, also known as the neighbor's roof. You squint at the horizon. What used to be a field is now a lake dotted with boats, rafts, and confused oxen. Your father calls it agri-marine development. You call it a disaster with marketing. Your body feels heavy, not just from the wet clothes or the cold air, but from the kind of tired that settles deep in your bones, like a house that's learned to sag from years of bad weather. You rub your face, and your hand comes away muddy. Congratulations, you've washed. Your day begins like every day of flood season, with the choice between doing something useless or doing nothing at all. Maybe you'll help patch the roof. Maybe you'll chase ducks back into their pen. Or maybe you'll just sit on a rock and stare at the water and try not to think about tomorrow. Because here, survival is a full-time job with no pay, no benefits, and a boss named Rain. You step outside and immediately regret it. The ground, which used to be dirt, then mud, then soup, is now just a suggestion of land beneath ankle-deep brown water. Your straw sandals, heroic in their own pathetic way, give up within 3 steps and float off toward the neighbor's goat shed. You watch them leave. You envy their freedom. Breakfast is next on the agenda, though that word might be a little generous. You slosh through the narrow path between houses, all built from wood that groans like it's composing a symphony of collapse. Someone's roof has partially caved in. The family is still inside, eating as if nothing happened. Survival breeds a strange kind of nonchalance. You find your uncle huddled under a tarp, boiling what you hope is porridge and not yesterday's river surprise. The fire crackles, fed by the driest thing you own, the family's old tax records. You sip your bowl cautiously. It tastes like ash, salt, and disappointment. It's hot, though, and that counts as luxury now. No one speaks much anymore. You all speak flood, now a language of nods, glances, and heavy sighs. Communication is mostly eye contact over soup. Occasionally, someone lets out a philosophical gem like still raining, or at least the lice can swim. Historians still argue whether Song Dynasty flood victims had access to meaningful community support, or were just left to tread water until the bureaucracy caught up. The emperor, from somewhere comfortably dry, had issued a decree about relief efforts. Rumor says the parchment sank before reaching your province. The homes along your lane are mostly elevated now, makeshift platforms built from discarded crates, furniture, and occasionally failed boats. One man tried to tie barrels to the legs of his house. It floated for about half a day before flipping, taking his chickens, 2 children, and a chessboard with it. He now plays chess alone, using pebbles and small bits of sadness. Bathing. You don't even ask anymore. The water you live in is the same water you would bathe in, cook in, and drink after boiling it for 7 hours and praying to at least 3 river gods. Even then, it's more of a gamble than a cleanse. You scratch your arm absent-mindedly. The rashes are new friends. Itchy, loyal, ever-present. You head back home with a bucket of water sloshing in your hands. This is the clean water, which means it only smells slightly like mildew and regret. You'll use it to rinse the last of the mold from your mother's rice dumplings. She's been pretending they're fresh for a week. You all play along. The theater of food is better than nothing. You pass children splashing in the shallows. It almost looks joyful, until you notice the bloated fish drifting beside them, belly up. One kid is trying to turn it into a toy boat. Childhood during a flood is equal parts creativity and poor judgment. At night, you curl up in your damp mat again, wrapped in a blanket that smells like wet hay and boiled despair. Rain taps against the roof like a bored relative who won't leave. You close your eyes and hope for a dream where you're dry, warm, and vaguely clean. It doesn't come. Because in the Song Dynasty flood year, even your dreams have mold. You wake up needing to pee. But this is no longer a simple problem. Nature calls, yes, but she's calling from the other side of a moat filled with floating cabbage leaves, someone's sandal, and a frog that seems far too confident in its territorial rights. You step outside your flooded hut, water rising just past your shins, and navigate to the toilet, a term that, during a Song Dynasty flood, translates roughly to a loose plank over something you hope is deep enough. Yours is wedged between two bamboo poles behind the shed. It has no walls. It has no dignity. The board wobbles as you step onto it, and for a moment, it feels like your ancestors are watching, laughing. You squat carefully, one eye on the horizon for passing neighbors, one on the sky. Praying lightning doesn't decide this is the moment to make you part of the historical record. Public toilets, they exist. Communal. Wooden structures perched on riverbanks with rows of holes cut into planks. Some fitted with bamboo privacy screens if you're lucky or wealthy. They're social hubs in a way, places where everyone hears everything and no one pretends otherwise. You've never known so much about your neighbor's digestive cycles. Toilets during floods are less sanitation and more performance art. No toilet paper, of course. Instead, leaves, strips of cloth, or the occasional smooth river stone, each with its own level of betrayal. You tried using rice husks once. Never again. You still flinch when you see porridge? Upstream from the toilet plank, your uncle has set fish traps. Downstream, the neighbors wash their laundry. Somewhere in between, hygiene gave up and moved to a different dynasty. Historians still argue whether hygiene during song floods deteriorated gradually or all at once. One local scholar told a scribe, before contracting something with too many syllables to pronounce, you call it squat cough. You return to your shack, balancing on tiptoes across submerged bricks like some reluctant acrobat. One slip, and it's a full-body baptism in a soup of humanity. It's happened before. You don't talk about it. Inside, you try drying your clothes by hanging them above the cooking fire. They steam more than they dry. One shirt has begun to sprout something green. You've named it Zhang. It's family now. The smell of the village is indescribable. But let's try anyway a bouquet of wet hemp, old fish, fermented tofu, human ambition, and the ghost of plum wine. It is, in a way, unforgettable. Mostly because it won't let go of your nostrils. In theory, government officials are supposed to inspect flood conditions, monitor health, and distribute relief. In practice, the last inspector arrived, took one look at the toilet situation, and invented a mysterious illness to retreat back upriver. You don't blame him. You lie back on your damp straw mat, stomach gurgling, unsure if it's hunger, illness, or your body just crying internally. You try to sleep, but the frog from earlier has found its way inside and is now croaking beneath the bedboard. You consider naming it. You consider eating it. You settle on glaring at it. In the Song Dynasty flood year, the bathroom doesn't provide relief. It's a trial, a gamble, and sometimes an act of acrobatic faith. It's morning or maybe late afternoon. You've stopped keeping track. Time is mostly just the interval between the last bowl of rice gruel and the next disappointment. Your stomach clenches. Not quite in hunger, but in the tired ache of knowing exactly what's coming. Again. You reach for your rations, pounded rice mixed with river water, stirred into a consistency known affectionately as flood porridge. It's gray. It jiggles. It smells vaguely of mud and regret. You eat it cold from a cracked bowl, because firewood is scarce, and, frankly, you're not sure heating it would improve things. On a good day, meaning no rats, beats you to the storage baskets, you might find some salted vegetables. Not fresh, of course. These are pickled and pickled again. Often in barrels that have seen better centuries. Still, they crunch. That counts for something. Meat that's a memory. A rumor. A luxury reserved for tax collectors and traveling monks with imperial connections. Once, a duck floated by in the floodwater, and the entire alley turned into a full-contact Olympic event. It was caught. It was cooked. It turned out to be a wooden decoy. Still tasted better than the porridge. You look around your shack. A moldy bag of millet sits under a chair leg, protecting it from the rising floor slime. Someone once tried mixing the millet with river snails for protein. It didn't end well. You've heard the phrase, "you are what you eat," and you're starting to worry that you're 40% sludge. Beer would help. But beer is a distant dream. Instead, you drink warm rice water, cloudy and tepid, with a slimy film on top that forms little islands you try not to look at. Boiling it might make it safer. But boiling anything requires fire. And fire requires dry kindling. And dry kindling is now officially listed as mythical creature in village folklore. Historians still argue whether diet during the Song floods contributed more to malnutrition or intestinal chaos. A monk once wrote in a margin, before doodling a tiny man drowning in a rice bowl, "You feel that the imperial court, hundreds of miles upriver, sends grain relief shipments when it remembers your province exists. Sometimes they arrive. Sometimes they sink. Sometimes they arrive already half-eaten by officials or bandits, or officials disguised as bandits, which is a popular side hustle. Your neighbor tries cooking with lotus roots. You don't ask where she finds them. You also don't ask what happened to her dog. Once a week, an old scholar walks through the village yelling about the importance of balanced nutrition. He has all his teeth and a very smug goose. No one listens to him. The goose is terrifying. For utensils, you use chopsticks made from mismatched bamboo scraps and a spoon that might once have been a ladle. You lost your actual spoon last week when it slipped into the porridge and vanished. You stirred for 10 minutes before giving up and pretending it was a garnish. Every bite is a negotiation with texture, flavor, and mortality. You don't chew. You just swallow and hope your digestive system is feeling brave today. Still, you eat. Because not eating is worse. Because in the Song Dynasty, especially during a flood year, food isn't about enjoyment. It's about survival. And maybe a little bit about pretending that today's rice gruel is slightly less depressing than yesterday's. You finish your meal. You burp. It tastes like fear. Now, we step barefoot into a dim, timber-framed long house somewhere in medieval Scandinavia. Smoke curls up from a central fire pit. The roof leaks. You're shivering in a damp wool tunic that smells faintly of goat and onion. There's a wedding happening technically, and someone just hurled a rock-hard loaf of barley bread directly at the bride. It bounces off her shoulder with a thud, and no one flinches. You would never think that love and stale carbs belonged in the same sentence, and yet, here we are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me your location and local time in the comments, just so I know who who else is dodging airborne pastries with me tonight. Because apparently, throwing food was good luck, or cathartic, or both. In some Norse and Baltic regions, the act of tossing bread, dried fish, or even cheese at newlyweds was seen as a form of blessing, or possibly a stress test. If you could survive a celebratory food ambush without flinching, maybe you'd survive the marriage too. The bread in question wasn't soft. It was made of rye, oats, and hardship. Brick-hard loaves could be reused across weddings and even doubled as doorstops when not flung at loved ones. And if no one ducked, congratulations. Your guests are now concussed with joy. Wedding feasts weren't just awkward table talk and watered-down ale. No, you had to earn your spot at the fire. Sometimes, guests had to bring offerings like smoked herring or perform challenges, such as balancing a clay pot on your head while reciting bad poetry. Romantic, no. Entertaining, also no. But deeply traditional, absolutely. Then there was the livestock ring toss. Some early Scandinavian wedding rituals featured a symbolic act where the groom attempted to toss a ring, sometimes braided twine or antler, onto the horn of a goat or ox. If it landed, prosperity. If it didn't, the goat walked away, smug. Historians still argue whether this was a fertility rite, a tribute to Thor, or just a cruel trick on the groom's coordination. And don't even think about wearing white. Brides wore layers of scratchy wool dyed with plant pigments brown, rust red, green if you were lucky. The concept of a wedding dress was mostly about not reeking of fish, and even that was a challenge. Hygiene was a theory. Perfume was juniper smoke. And you've now got crumbs in your hair and a goat chewing your sleeve. One quirky tidbit. Some wedding guests believed that hiding breadcrumbs in their shoes would bring them a spouse within the year. Which, given the mold, content might explain why most opted to remain single. And historians still debate whether the bread throwing was a pagan holdover or just a clever way to get rid of leftovers. But either way, you lived the longhouse slightly bruised, slightly amused, and with a newfound respect for aerodynamic baking. You slosh across a muddy courtyard in southern France, somewhere in the 13th century, following the scent of garlic and the sound of forced enthusiasm. The wedding is in full swing, and you're just in time for the chicken race. Yes, apparently nothing says eternal devotion like a poultry-based obstacle course. The bride and groom stand awkwardly, holding hands like they're being supervised. At their feet, a confused chicken is released into a makeshift pen. The challenge. The groom must catch it barefoot, blindfolded, and while the bride hurls mildly threatening bread rolls in his general direction. It's romantic in the same way that a medieval dentist appointment might be considered a spa day. In some villages, capturing the chicken symbolized providing for the family. In others, it was just a way to prove the groom wasn't entirely useless. If he failed to catch it, local widows would cackle and shout things like, "Try again, next spring," in Occitan dialects, which somehow made it worse. Once captured, the chicken was not spared. It was cooked into the wedding stew, a suspicious cauldron of things that had once clucked, crawled, or squelched. Into the pot went the honorary bird, some root vegetables, and a handful of things no one would admit to bringing. You don't choose the stew chooses you, and sometimes it chooses vengeance. Then came the bedding song. If you're imagining something gentle and sweet, stop. The entire wedding party, drunk, muddy, and increasingly rowdy, would escort the newlyweds to their bedchamber, chanting increasingly explicit rhymes about what was expected to happen next. Some threw rose petals, some threw onions. A few threw up. The spirit was the same group enthusiasm, lightly seasoned with mortification. One curious fringe custom in parts of Gascony. It was considered lucky to hide a small wooden spoon in the bride's undergarments. Why? Because symbolism. Because fertility. Because no one thought to invent boundaries until at least the 17th century. And the clothes, dear listener, the clothes. The groom often wore bright yellow or blue tunics, occasionally accessorized with feathers. The bride's dress might include bells sewn into the hem, so that villagers could literally hear her approaching matrimony from several blocks away. Subtle never. Practical. Almost impressively not. Historians still argue whether the chicken chase was originally a fertility rite, a parody of courtship, or just rural boredom weaponized into tradition. But either way, you end the evening full of stew, deaf from bells, and still wondering what happened to that spoon. You awaken groggily on a goatskin mat in the damp shade of a stone roundhouse in 11th century Ireland. Outside, the wedding is beginning not with vows or veils, but with shouting, spit swapping, and a hearty slap of raw meat on the altar. You'd think that sounds like an exaggeration. You'd be wrong. In Gaelic tradition, hand fasting wasn't just a folksy rom-com phrase. It involved literal binding wrists tied with woven cords, often from the bride's own hair. Because naturally, no one worried about hygiene. Everyone worried about whether the couple could untangle their wrists without breaking into a marital spat. If they did, a bad omen. If they didn't, slightly less bad. The most memorable part? Trial marriages. For real. Some Irish communities practiced what was called a year-and-a-day union. Couples could test drive married life for 13 months, and then either renew it or mutually ghost each other before the term even existed. Medieval prenup. Meet medieval break clause. Historians still argue whether these trial unions were actually legal contracts or just an elaborate excuse to throw multiple weddings with leftover ale. A quirky tidbit: the groom had to present his bride with a gift called the log en enech, literally. The face price. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't flowers. It was a public declaration that the bride's honor had literal value, often measured in cows or pigs, or the neighbor's mysteriously missing goose. You know, romance. And if you're wondering whether someone sang something sentimental, yes. But usually, it was a bard recounting your ancestors' heroic deeds, which may or may not have involved cattle raids, sibling betrayal, or turning into a swan. You don't get to pick your family. You get to chant about their crimes in lyrical verse. Once married, the new couple didn't kiss. They shared a ceremonial sip of mead. If you're imagining a tender moment, think again. This was closer to a chug-off. The bride had to drink enough to show enthusiasm, but not so much that she tripped over the pig tethered near the fire. The pig was symbolic of fertility, or maybe supper. Historians still argue that part. And finally, the wedding night. Not private, no curtains. Instead, the villagers might linger outside, offering helpful shouts of encouragement and wedding night wisdom that no one asked for. Some even drummed, rhythmically, like this was a team sport. All this while you sleep in your itchy wool tunic, which somehow weighs more wet than dry. You sigh, wondering what happens if the couple calls it off after a year and a day. Spoiler, they both keep the pigs, but not the spoon. You blink into a haze of incense and gold-threaded silk. It's hot, very hot. Because now you're in medieval Byzantium, 11th century Constantinople. To be precise, just in time for a wedding that's more political than poetic. The bride draped in 10 layers of embroidered fabric and personal anxiety. The groom, probably still negotiating with the bride's uncle about land rights, because nothing says romance like a spreadsheet made of parchment. Now, We're not exaggerating when we say this ceremony takes days. Byzantine weddings were more marathon than moment. First, a public bath. For the groom, not the bride, because patriarchy. Then came the ceremonial crowning, which sounds regal until you realize the crowns were sometimes borrowed and made of stiff olive branches. You know, the same thing you might use to swat flies. Historians still argue whether the crowns symbolize martyrdom, kingship, or just a really intense headache. Then comes the part that makes you question every rom-com you've ever seen the Proteleia, or pre-wedding rituals. This included inspecting the bride's dowry, not privately, but in a whole room display, like a medieval IKEA showroom. Each item was paraded and judged by the in-laws. Oh, she only brought 2 wool looms, must be love, a quirky bit. There was an actual wedding coordinator, known as a nymphagogos, whose job was to escort the bride from her parents' home to the groom's in a fancy cart, covered in fabric dyed with imported saffron, guarded by eunuchs. Yes, plural, because one eunuch simply won't do for a solid Byzantine procession. The wedding sermon was long, in Greek, with theological metaphors that would make even modern churchgoers check their watches. It often referenced Adam and Eve, but instead of apples, it focused on obedience and spiritual union. No pressure. The feasting, however, was exceptional. Roast peacocks, almond pastries, and so much honeyed wine you'd swear your goblet was a portal to another dimension. Guests brought riddles instead of gifts. That's right, riddles. Because in Byzantium, impressing people with your brain was more important than showing up with a blender. Then came the consummation, which was not only expected, but brace yourself, sometimes witnessed. Not directly, but symbolically. Sheets were inspected, tokens exchanged. There was even a congratulatory chant performed the morning after, called the epithalamion. Yes, the neighbors really did sing you awake on your first married morning. You're welcome. And while you lie there, sweat pooling in your elbows under 5 layers of ceremonial linen, you think this might be love, or dehydration, possibly both. You now find yourself standing in a muddy village clearing in 13th century Lithuania, where wedding bells are replaced by the sound of goat hooves and war drums. You're here for a Baltic pagan wedding, equal parts spiritual ceremony and light contact sport. And no, you didn't mishear the priest chant. That's not Latin. It's an old tongue, half growl, half riddle, and somehow you've just been blessed with fertility using a dead fish. Now, before we dive deeper into this earthy ritual, take a moment to appreciate the groom's fashion. A bear pelt draped across one shoulder, antler crown askew, and enough leather straps to outfit a small theater troupe. The bride, meanwhile, is barefoot because shoes are for after the gods accept your union, and maybe after the goat is milked. The ceremony begins with a couple tied together, literally. Their hands are bound with braided grass, often soaked in honey wine. Romantic? Yes. Hygienic? Debatable. Historians still argue whether this hand-fasting ritual symbolized unity or was simply a way to prevent the groom from bolting mid-vow. As the fire is lit and the drumming intensifies, the village elder chants blessings, invoking Dievas, the sky god, and Lema, goddess of fate and childbirth. The goal is to convince the spirits that this union won't end in crop failure or in-laws from hell. And speaking of in-laws, they each bring bread. Not to eat, oh no, but to press against the couple's foreheads. Because bread, apparently, absorbs evil energy and disappointing marital decisions. And then comes the chicken test. Yes. A live chicken is brought out and allowed to walk between the couple. If it clucks contentedly and doesn't flee, good omens abound. If it poops on the bride's foot, that's a mixed signal. The couple must then chase it together again, symbolizing teamwork or poultry-based humiliation. The line is thin. Post-ceremony, there's a screaming competition. The bride's female relatives sing sharp, ululating songs called rowdos, mourning her departure from childhood. Meanwhile, the groom's family tries to drown him out with horn blasts and crude jokes. The result is a kind of sonic brawl, where love and anxiety harmonize at 120 decibels. Later, after enough mead has been consumed to anesthetize an ox, the couple is led to a hay-filled barn where neighbors awkwardly pile gifts, carved spoons, bundles of flax, and sometimes a single, judgmental cat. They are expected to emerge the next morning looking disheveled but spiritually aligned. Quirky fact: some villages also buried a miniature clay figure under the wedding fire, a symbolic ancestor witness. Yes, a tiny fired clay grandfather watches you get married and probably whispers critique from beneath the embers. As you settle into your rough blanket and sip the last of your nettle tea, you realize this wasn't just a wedding. It was a survival trial. And if you can make it through that chicken poop, cat stare, screaming songs, you might just make it through marriage too. You're not sure how you got here, but suddenly you're standing on a hot stone patio in 12th century Andalusia, where perfume lingers in the air and marriages come with contracts, clauses, and brace yourself public poetry competitions. This is a Muslim wedding in Al-Andalus, where even romance is intellectualized. The courtyard shimmers under the midday sun, and before the bride even appears, two men in long robes are arguing over metaphors. Apparently, the groom has compared his beloved to the moon, and a rival poet insists that's overdone. You would never think that getting married could involve defending a simile. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, comment your location and local time. I'm curious, who else is sitting through ancient wedding drama in their pajamas? Anyway, back to the marriage. The actual ceremony is surprisingly brief. A formal contract, or nikah, is signed with witnesses present. The bride doesn't even need to be in the room, just nearby and consenting, preferably with a trusted representative. Historians still argue whether this distant but legally binding setup was meant to protect women's autonomy or simply a practical solution to overly crowded households. The real action comes after the walima, or wedding feast. Imagine table after table, groaning under dates, lamb stews, honey-soaked pastries, and more spices than a medieval apothecary. And here's your quirky tidbit of the day in some noble households. A live peacock would be presented at the feast not to be eaten, but to dazzle. You are, after all, what your poultry can flex during the feast. Poets recite verses praising the couple, but not always sincerely. Sometimes, poets would roast the groom with gentle sarcasm. He seeks wisdom, yet marries. Let us pray for his confusion. It's the medieval equivalent of a best man's toast. If the best man had a degree in Arabic literature and a grudge. As the music rises, drums, lutes, and the occasional off-key flute, the bride finally appears, veiled and glowing. Not with makeup, mind you, but with saffron. Women would dust their skin with saffron paste to appear golden in candlelight. The result? Stunning and faintly aromatic, like love wrapped in spice-racked nostalgia. The couple then shares a symbolic sip of milk and honey, believed to bless their union with sweetness. But if you're lactose intolerant, tough luck. Medieval romance doesn't come with dietary disclaimers. And for those of you waiting for the awkward bit, yes. There's a tradition where guests throw rose petals or sometimes actual coins at the couple. The message: beauty is fleeting, but wealth is practical. By nightfall, the courtyard glows with lanterns, guests dance, elders nod with approval, and you, covered in a thin layer of rose petals and goat cheese crumbs, reflect on a wedding that felt less like a party and more like a philosophy seminar with snacks. You awaken in the cold, damp air of 14th century Lithuania, where wedding rituals are less about saffron and poetry and more about kidnapping, screaming, and occasionally, wolves. Welcome to a Baltic betrothal, where romance is measured by endurance and how many bruises you get carrying your bride across the threshold. The wedding begins not with flowers, but with fire, a literal fire. Villagers light bonfires to ward off spirits, ill omens, and, presumably, wedding jitters. You would never think that getting married would start with a borderline pagan exorcism, but here we are, roasting turnips and chanting blessings at dusk. The groom doesn't exactly ask for the bride's hand. Instead, there's a ceremonial abduction, a staged kidnapping, where the groom and his friends charge in on horseback, steal the bride from her home, and ride off into the forest. It's all in good fun, historians say, though they also admit some grooms got carried away. Historians still argue whether these rituals were symbolic or just a convenient excuse for a bunch of drunk cousins to swing swords. Once the bride is rescued from the wilderness or the neighbor's barn, depending on the village, the wedding proceeds with another layer of theater crying. Professionally, brides are encouraged to wail during the ceremony, loudly and dramatically, to show sorrow for leaving her family. Bonus points for squeezing out actual tears. If you've ever cried at a wedding, congratulations, you're culturally aligned with medieval Lithuanians. A mainstream historical fact. These ceremonies were often held in longhouses, shared with animals, where guests feasted on rye bread, pork fat, and sour beer brewed in wooden barrels. No tablecloths, no cutlery, just communal bowls and fingers. Because forks were still viewed with suspicion, as were hygiene and second-hand shoes. And here's your quirky tidbit in some regions. Brides wore tall, pointed hats, covered in layers of wool, ribbons, and beads. Not for beauty, for height. The taller your hat, the more fertile your future. Which explains why some brides look less like women and more like a Renaissance kebab. After the feast, the veil change occurs. The bride's maiden veil is removed and replaced with a matron's cap, signaling her new status. It's quiet, almost sacred, until someone breaks wind, or the groom drops the honey mead jug, which apparently happens more than you'd expect. Night falls. The guests sing folk songs that mostly sound like someone trying to remember lyrics while freezing to death. You sit by the fire, eating a piece of fish that still has eyeballs, wondering how anyone survives this amount of fermented dairy. And then the dance. A slow, stomping circle of muddy boots, fur-trimmed coats, and the occasional barefoot uncle. You link arms, pretend you know the steps, and hope no one notices your hat is slipping. The couple disappears into a small room at the back of the house. Privacy is a luxury, but there's a curtain, just one, thin linen, and the elders hover just beyond it, singing lullabies. Romance depends on your definition, but you've survived the fire, the screaming, and the sour beer. You're officially married now. We drift eastward to the glittering paradox of medieval Korea, where Confucian values dressed in silk collide head-on with in-law politics so vicious they could give Game of Thrones a run for its money. Here, a wedding isn't so much about love, it's a tactical maneuver. one that ideally ends with more rice fields and fewer assassinations. You don't get to choose your spouse. That honor belongs to your parents, your grandparents, and, depending on the dynasty, a professional matchmaker who judges compatibility using birth signs, family records, and how many pigs your uncle owns. Love. That's a post-marriage activity like learning to garden or tolerating fermented cabbage. So, before the big day, the groom sends over to NABPay literally a box of wedding gifts. It's hand-delivered with great ceremony, because nothing says eternal devotion like dried fish and silk socks. Historians still argue whether the bride's family actually cared about the gifts or just used them to rank suitors like an Olympic judge with a red lacquer fan. You, the bride, don't go to the groom's house until sunset. There's a parade, first complete, with red umbrellas, bronze gongs, and a palanquin carried by servants who absolutely hate their job. The bride sits inside, covered in red cloth, and isn't supposed to speak, smile, or sneeze. Any noise might signal bad fortune, or worse, personality. Arriving at the groom's family home, you dismount and bow, not just once, dozens of times, to every elder, ancestor, and decorative vase in the household. Welcome to filial piety, where your knees do more work than your heart. The wedding itself, quiet, ridiculously quiet. There's no kiss, no vows, no champagne toast. You and the groom sit facing each other and bow, slowly and silently, as if playing a turn-based, emotionless chess match. He bows. You bow. He drinks tea. You drink tea. He tries not to fall asleep. You pretend you already have. And here comes the quirky bit. The groom wears a hat so tall and floppy, it looks like a rejected magician costume, while the bride's headpiece weighs about as much as a toddler and contains enough gold wire to power a minor city. Comfort is not the goal. Status is, and so is posture. So try not to faint. After the ceremony, you're taken to a special room for the harmonization ritual. This sounds romantic. It is not. It involves sitting in silence while elders murmur about family duties and hand you a spoon. Not to eat with, just to hold, symbolically, because apparently no one's allowed to feel normal at their own wedding. By morning, the bride begins her new life one step below the mother-in-law and two below the family rooster. You rise before dawn to make tea, manage the storeroom, and, if you're lucky, cry into your hanbok, where no one can see. Love, maybe, eventually, right after the laundry. And yet there's elegance, there's ceremony, there's the strange poetry of tradition, even if you're drowning in silks and social expectation. It's quiet, yes, but beneath the stillness, everything is changing. Now, we wander west again this time, to the frost-bitten hills of medieval Scandinavia, where wedding traditions blend Norse paganism with emerging Christian customs in ways that feel less like a romance and more like a drinking contest punctuated by blood oaths and interpretive goat herding. First, there's the engagement, which doesn't involve rings or proposals under candlelight. It's brokered like a business merger, only the assets are sheep, fields, and the occasional barrel of pickled herring. Fathers gather over a feast, negotiate terms, and seal the deal with a handshake that may or may not include the swapping of swords. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or just bad planning when someone forgot the wine. The bride, she gets a dowry cows, a comb, and if she's lucky, a chest filled with wool. The groom offers a mourning gift, which sounds sweet until you realize it's basically thanks for marrying me. Here's a sheep. Romance. Thy name is livestock. Come wedding day, the couple drinks from a shared cup of mead. This cup has likely been used by generations before them. wiped with someone's tunic, and filled to the brim with something so fermented it might qualify as sentient. You raise it to your lips, sip politely, and pray not to black out before the ceremony begins. Speaking of the ceremony, it takes place on a sacred stone or within a church, depending on the century and the current mood of Christianity in your village. Either way, you're wearing layers of linen and wool, and your hair is braided into a style so complicated that historians still argue whether anyone ever successfully unraveled it without divine intervention. Quirky tidbit. Some Scandinavian brides had their hair ceremonially unbraided by the groom before the wedding night, because nothing says intimacy like an hour-long detangling session with wooden combs in sub-zero temperatures. It's less 50 shades of gray and more 50 knots of hay. The wedding feast lasts 3 days, or 7, or until everyone runs out of meat. The bride is expected to serve ale, smile dutifully, and possibly dance with her new in-laws, who will judge her footwork like it's a royal audition. Meanwhile, the groom is slapped on the back, toasted repeatedly, and occasionally challenged to feats of strength by his drunk uncle, Olaf. At some point, usually after several rounds of boiled eel and poetry, the couple is led to the bridal bed by an entire procession of family members. Yes, everyone walks you there. Sometimes they sing, sometimes they just giggle. And no, you don't get privacy. In some cases, a witness remains to confirm the marriage was consummated, which is just a fancy medieval word for awkward. And then it's quiet. The laughter fades. The torches flicker low. You lie there, full of bread, wearing clothes you can't remove without help, beside a stranger who smells faintly of pine tar and goat. But maybe, just maybe, it works. Maybe marriage is less about fireworks and more about shared winters, sour soup, and surviving Viking raids together. Maybe the ritual, however bizarre, is the glue that holds the chaos in place. And now, as the fire dies low in that longhouse by the fjord, and the drums fall silent beneath the snow, you drift gently, silently, into a sleep that smells faintly of mead and wool and centuries gone by. Now, we dine in the candle-lit haze of a Roman banquet hall, where sweat, incense, and the unmistakable tang of fermented fish sauce compete to dominate your nostrils. You're reclining awkwardly on a couch, not sitting, because apparently chairs are for peasants elbow deep in a platter of olives and goat cheese. Across from you, a man named Gaius laughs so hard wine dribbles from his nose. He hasn't bathed in weeks. You'd think that attending a lavish feast in one of the world's most sophisticated empires would smell like roasted lamb or baked bread. You would never think it smells like someone left a fish market in the sun for a month. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop your location and local time in the comments below, because someone is probably watching this while eating toast. Anyway, back to the Romans. The centerpiece of your host's menu tonight is garum, a fermented fish sauce aged in clay pots until it reaches peak pungency. Think of it as ketchup if ketchup were made by letting anchovies rot in their own juices and then bottling the runoff. Garum was poured on everything meats, vegetables, even fruit. The richer you were, the more garum you used. Imagine that your status measured by your tolerance for stink. The bread is dry enough to double as masonry. Seriously, this stuff can scratch a table. Roman loaves were often round, heavy, and sometimes embedded with stones or ash depending on how carefully they were baked. There's no butter, there's no dip, there's just garum. Next comes the stuffed dormouse, a delicacy so beloved that aristocrats raised these little guys in special clay jars with built-in running wheels. They're fed figs and nuts to fatten them up. then stuffed with minced pork and herbs before being roasted. They arrive on the table, looking like tiny meat balloons. You poke one. It jiggles. Then you remember this is the highlight. Don't worry, there's still time for some oysters, preferably served raw and questionably fresh. Roman emperors had them imported from distant coasts in seawater-filled barrels. The idea was to maintain their freshness. The reality was debatable. Historians still argue whether these oysters caused more aphrodisiac feelings or food poisoning. Meanwhile, the entertainment includes dancers, flutists, or that one guy juggling flaming torches near an extremely flammable curtain. Safety is a future concern. The evening's aroma, cocktail body odor, incense, spiced wine, and slow roasting goose is thick enough to chew. And remember, you're reclining while eating. The whole lean on your left elbow thing is meant to aid digestion, or make it easier to pass out from overeating. Scholars disagree on whether this was good for your stomach or just an upper-class fashion flex. So as you dip your dry bread into a puddle of fish goo while sipping wine that's been sweetened with lead, yes, lead. Just know you're living the Roman high life. Congratulations, your dinner is trying to kill you, but in a very luxurious way. You've now stumbled, still reclined, into the next course, which involves something called sow's womb. It's exactly what it sounds like. The womb of a pregnant pig, boiled, seasoned, and served as a delicacy. Because apparently, Roman chefs had a game going who can turn the weirdest organ into the fanciest entree. You bite in, it's chewy, too chewy, and somewhere an enslaved cook is giggling silently. In Rome, food wasn't just food, it was theater, competition, and aristocratic one-upmanship. The wealthiest hosts would serve courses meant to shock or outdo the last dinner you went to. Got served flamingo tongues last week. This week, you're getting roasted parrot with honey glaze, because nothing says refined like flamboyantly plumed birds caramelized beyond recognition. Historians still argue whether these exotic birds were meant to be eaten or just shown off, like edible jewelry. Now, you've arrived at what the Romans thought of as dessert. Brace yourself. There's globy fried balls of dough soaked in honey and sometimes sprinkled with poppy seeds. Sounds okay? Right, except the dough is made from cheese curds. You're eating cheese fritters drenched in sugar. It's a little like biting into a sweet mozzarella donut. If mozzarella donuts were invented in a public bathhouse and flavored with goat milk. But don't forget the drinks. The wine has been diluted with water because drinking it straight is for barbarians, then mixed with herbs, dates, or seawater for flavor. Yet Romans were inventive with beverages in the same way toddlers are inventive with art supplies. It's exciting until someone drinks ink. There's also Posca sour, vinegary wine blend often consumed by soldiers. You try it, you immediately regret it. And somewhere in this culinary escapade, someone brings out boiled crane. Yep, that long-legged swamp bird, boiled until it's tender and gray. Then, for extra flair, its beak is dipped in gold. Because why not ruin two things at once? You're still reclining, mind you, half laying on a couch that smells faintly of mildew, surrounded by men in togas adjusting their belts and belching politely. The air is thick. The torches are burning low. The servers, usually enslaved teenagers, slip between guests, silently, trying to avoid being noticed unless someone wants more fermented sow's bladder, which, yes, is also a dish. One interesting tidbit, Roman recipes were rarely written with quantities. They simply assumed the cook knew what a handful of crushed herbs meant. Precision was for stonemasons, not soup. And flavor profiles often competed rather than complemented. Imagine black pepper, honey, and vinegar all in one dish. Having an argument in your mouth. You reach for a fig. It's safe. It's sweet. It's soft. It hasn't been stuffed with anything. You sigh with relief. But just as you chew, someone offers you roasted peacock brain. The mood darkens, still reclining. You smile faintly. You're not sure if it's gratitude, nausea, or just muscle fatigue from leaning on one elbow for 3 hours straight. But you've survived 2 courses of Rome's finest. You're officially cultured and slightly queasy. You're not reclining anymore. You're standing now in Tenochtitlan. Or rather, you're swaying slightly on the edge of a floating chinampa farm, where corn rustles in the wind, and the aroma of wood smoke and chili smacks you like a spiritual awakening and possibly an allergy. Welcome to an Aztec feast. Bring your appetite and maybe a strong stomach. The Aztecs didn't use forks, and neither do you. You're handed a freshly steamed tamale, the ancestor of your modern-day tamale. It's filled with beans and squash, wrapped in corn husk, and plot twist drenched in a mole sauce that contains over 30 ingredients, including unsweetened chocolate, chili peppers, and ashes. You bite in, it's savory, then bitter, then spicy. Then it punches you in the throat and whispers, "You're not from around here." The crowd around you laughs as you sputter. You're the only one drinking water. Everyone else is sipping pulque, a cloudy, slightly viscous alcoholic beverage made from fermented agave sap. It's sour. It's funky. It tastes like someone dared milk to become beer, but gave it the weekend off. Historians still argue whether pulque was sacred nourishment or just a cultural excuse to get day drunk with the gods. Your next offering is a huautle, sometimes called insect caviar, the eggs of aquatic insects collected in lakes, dried, and then fried into little patties. Think quinoa meets wasp nest. The texture is wrong, but you're committed now. You add a dab of salsa made with green tomatoes and crushed ants and pretend you're on a reality TV show. One fun fringe fact: Aztecs were masters of protein efficiency, while medieval Europeans chewed on questionable pork and year-old cheese. The Aztecs were raising axolotls? Yes. Those adorable water salamanders as food, grilled or stewed, slightly gelatinous. You're staring at one now. Its face is still smiling at you. You do not smile back. And if you thought Aztec meals were just about the food, think again. Every dish is layered with symbolism. Corn isn't just corn. It's a deity. Eating tortillas is basically communion with the sun god. Even beans have names and moods. You chew slowly, trying not to offend anyone on a metaphysical level. There's music. 2 drums pounding, flutes whining, and the occasional ceremonial chant. You sway with the rhythm. Or maybe that's the pulque talking. Someone offers you huitlacoche, or corn smut. It's a fungus that grows on corn kernels, turning them into black, bulbous lumps. You're told it's a delicacy. You pretend it's truffle. It is not truffle. The feast winds down with dessert amaranth bars, sweetened with honey and maybe blood. Yes, maybe. Because while most scholars agree blood was reserved for rituals, a few argue it may have flavored food during festivals, just a drop, for divine seasoning. You exhale, finally full, or stunned. Either way, your taste buds have traveled. Your modern palate, raised on store-bought pudding and Instagram avocado toast, is now in full retreat. Still, you've survived the night. The gods are appeased. You haven't thrown up in public, a success by any ancient metric. You're back in Rome, again, reclining on another couch. This time, you're at the banquet of a noble woman whose name is longer than your grocery list. There's a dog the size of a horse under the table, and you're 70% sure it's been trained to eat scraps and intruders. torches flicker. A eunuch refills your cup. You have no idea what time it is. But you know one thing for certain. You're about to eat something that once moved. The first course is called garum, a fermented fish sauce that was, in Roman times, the ketchup of everything. But calling it fish sauce is like calling a thunderstorm a light drizzle. Garum is made by piling anchovies, salt, herbs, and possibly entire sea monsters into large ceramic vats and letting them rot under the sun for months. The result? A golden brown liquid that smells like a seafood crime scene and tastes oddly divine. Historians still argue whether garum was ever considered clean by Roman hygiene standards, or if the stench just meant it was ready. A young servant brings you stuffed dormice next. Yes, mice. Roasted whole, coated in honey, and stuffed with herbs and pine nuts. They look like small, crispy sausages that used to squeak. You close your eyes. Crunch. Surprisingly good if you ignore the little toes. Then comes the boiled ostrich. A dish so grand it deserves its own trumpet fanfare. It's served in slices, swimming in a sweet date sauce. You chew, and chew, and chew some more. Ostrich is the medieval chewing gum of the animal kingdom. You wonder how many servants it took to chase the bird down. Hopefully more than one. For texture and psychological warfare, you're given jellied sow's udder. It jiggles when the platter moves. It jiggles when you blink. It jiggles in your soul. This was a delicacy meant to show off wealth, status, and your lack of dental standards. One fringe detail. The Romans sometimes dyed their dishes with crushed flowers or minerals. So it wasn't just jiggly, it could be bright purple. You eat a polite spoonful. It tastes like regret, with a hint of mint. Your dining neighbor. A portly senator with grape juice on his chin points out the centerpiece flamingo tongues. Yes, multiple, apparently. They're prized for their delicate flavor, which, given the number of tongues on the plate, might just be an elaborate prank. You watch as he pops one into his mouth and nods with the confidence of someone who's tasted extinction. You pass. Meanwhile, someone mentions peacock brain pie served cold, of course. Because what better way to insult both birds and bakers? At once, historians still argue whether this was reserved for emperors or just overly dramatic chefs. The conversation turns philosophical. Someone recites Ovid. Someone else tries to juggle figs. The dog snores. A woman to your left is eating a fig stuffed with live ants. You look away. She offers you one. You pretend to sneeze. Finally, dessert arrives libum, a type of Roman cheesecake made with ricotta and bay leaves. A moment of calm. A small, sweet mercy in a parade of stomach-churning chaos. You sit back, not full, not hungry, just transformed, somewhere. Your ancestors are clapping or sobbing. You wake up somewhere hotter, much hotter. Welcome to the Aztec Empire land of pyramids, poetry, and food that looks you in the eye before you eat it. You're seated on a woven reed mat at a ceremonial feast, surrounded by hummingbird feathers, flower garlands, and enough chili to stun a bison. Your mouth is dry. Your instincts scream. Eat nothing. Smile politely. Now, we feast on axolotl stew. Yes, the adorable amphibians with frilly gills and big eyes. They're floating now in a rich tomato chili broth, seasoned with herbs and melancholy. Supposedly a delicacy for nobles. It's believed the Aztecs associated axolotls with gods, especially the one who turned into one to escape death. Irony is served hot. Historians still argue whether eating them was religious devotion or just culinary enthusiasm with a dash of mythology. Next up, tamales, but not your abuela's recipe. These are stuffed with grasshoppers, crunchy, protein-packed, and disturbingly enthusiastic about escaping your tortilla. You're handed two. You pretend to inspect the masa while discreetly slipping one under your mat. It twitches. You cough. Then comes escamoles, known to modern marketers as insect caviar. But let's call it what it is, ant larvae sautéed in butter and chili. They're oddly nutty, like tiny, wriggling pine nuts. A fringe tidbit, some Aztec chefs cook them inside agave leaves to give them a smoky twist. You're not sure if the flavor is smoke or shame. You chew anyway. The feast continues with tecolote stew, made from owls. Yes, owls. Sacred birds of the night. The meat is dark, rich, and hard to describe, somewhere between pigeon and philosophical guilt. Your host grins, revealing teeth dyed red from chewing annatto seeds. You nod in respect, or fear. You're handed a cup of pulque, a fermented drink made from agave sap. It's white, foamy, and smells like yeasty socks left in the sun. The texture is disobedient, thick but runny, sour but sweet. The drink of farmers, priests, and anyone willing to forget what cleanliness tastes like. You gulp. It bites back. As the drums begin to thrum, you're offered turtle eggs, lightly smoked and dipped in chili salt. They're soft, creamy, and deeply illegal in many timelines. But here, a treat, a symbol of status, a casual way to start cholesterol warfare. A nobleman leans over, whispering about human meat tamales. Your spine freezes. Only in ceremonies, he adds. Only the bad ones. His smile is too calm. You look down at your plate. It's beans. Hopefully. Historians still argue whether reports of ritual cannibalism were exaggerated by horrified Spanish chroniclers, or whether the Aztecs really did incorporate prisoners of war into their celebratory menu. Either way, tonight's feast stays with you. In your memories, in your stomach, possibly in your nightmares. A boy dances past wearing a jaguar pelt and balancing a bowl of fermented corn pudding on his head. It's dessert, apparently. You take a bite. It's warm, slightly sour, and oddly comforting, like mashed sadness mixed with cinnamon. You lie back on the mat. Somewhere, a flute wails. You burp quietly and wonder, was that axolotl? Blinking. You don't wake up so much as resurface. The Aztec drums still echo in your head, but now the air feels drier, the mood more formal, and the smell less chilly. More fermented fish sauce. And yes, welcome to a Roman convivium, the elite banquet of ancient Rome, where reclining on couches while devouring everything in sight is not just accepted, it's fashionable. You're lying on your left side, propped up by embroidered cushions. Your tunic is slightly itchy, and your dignity, that's already slipping, because a slave just poured perfumed oil on your hands and offered you a towel made of silk. Don't get used to it. You're still expected to eat with your fingers. First dish, stuffed dormice. Not metaphorical. Real rodents. They're baked in clay ovens, stuffed with minced pork, pepper, and pine nuts, then glazed with honey. The dish is a status symbol because nothing screams I'm wealthy like rodent hors d'oeuvres. Historians still argue whether these delicacies were daily fare or reserved for ostentatious show-offs, trying to impress senators with squirrel tapas. And now, the smell of garum enters your soul. Garum is fish sauce, but not the fun Vietnamese kind. It's made by fermenting fish guts in the sun for weeks. The scent is unforgettable. The taste surprisingly complex. They put it on everything. It's ketchup, mayo, and salt all rolled into one sloshy horror. Time for something exotic, flamingo tongue. Yes, flamingos. Their tongues, specifically. Supposedly delicate, allegedly sweet. You stare at the pink sliver on your plate and can't help thinking this is the Roman version of posting your meal on Instagram. Look what I hunted near the Nile. No filters needed. One fringe tidbit, some Roman recipes called for boiled ostrich, served with date and vinegar sauce. A bird too big to fly, served to people too rich to care. The texture is chewy, like eating a sandal made of dignity. Your host claps. Slaves bring out the second course, which confusingly includes both oysters and pig udders. Yes, you heard right. Udders, boiled, sliced, served with herbs. Roman cookbooks praised their tenderness. You chew. It's soft, unsettlingly soft. Dessert. That's for later. First comes stuffed sow's womb, a dish described in Apicius' cookbook. It's a complicated concoction involving hard-boiled eggs, minced meat, and the reproductive tract of a pig. You poke at it, it jiggles. You pretend it's flan. One of the senators across from you belches loudly. Applause follows. This is a compliment to the chef. You try to burp, quietly, but instead you hiccup. That earns a raised eyebrow and a refill of wine mulsum, sweetened with honey, thick as syrup, warm from being stored next to a hypocaust. Historians still debate whether the Roman elite truly enjoyed this menu, or whether it was more performance art, a way of turning cuisine into theater, politics into dinner conversation. After all, nothing bonds you like trying not to die from overindulgence. Someone brings out live sea urchins, cracked open at the table. The slimy yellow insides are scooped into a silver spoon. You manage to swallow one. It tastes like regret, soaked in seawater. As the lyre music drifts through the air and the torches cast flickering shadows across the mosaic floor, you begin to feel lightheaded, not from the wine, but from the realization this was how Rome dined while its empire crumbled slowly around it. Flamingo tongues and all. You remain half reclined, delicately bloated, woozy with fish guts and flamingo protein. And somehow, the Romans aren't done. The dining room transforms not with music or fireworks, but with yet more food. Dessert arrives with fanfare and a slight whiff of something questionable. You would expect fruit, maybe honey cakes. And yes, there are figs and dates, but they're served beside a dish called libum, a sacred cheesecake made of goat cheese, flour, and egg, offered to the gods and then to your stomach. The crust is crisp, the middle squishy, and the taste lands somewhere between bland and And then someone brings out coagulated cow's blood fritters, deep fried, mildly seasoned, and dipped in honey. The texture is like biting into a warm sponge that whispers, "I used to be alive." These were likely a peasant dish, though elite Romans had a fondness for rustic authenticity, especially when the peasantry wasn't invited to the table. Historians still argue whether this crossover was admiration or appropriation, or just boredom. You had a final platter cooked sow's udder, again, but this time candied. Roman sugar was rare, but honey was everywhere. They glazed meat with it, smeared it on nuts. And if Apicius is to be believed, used it to mask the taste of old leftovers. No fridge, no problem. Just add bees. The quirky tidbit of the night, some banquets ended with feats of digestion contests to see who could eat the most dormice, or vomit the least flamboyantly. Yes, vomiting was normalized. The vomitorium was not a bathroom, but a corridor still. The elite had no shame in refreshing their stomachs mid-meal. More food meant more power, more spectacle, and more regrets. And finally, dessert wine. Syrupy, warm, spiced with herbs. A toast is made in honor of Bacchus, god of wine and poor decisions. You sip. Your stomach gurgles. The room spins like a badly edited historical documentary. As the oil lamps burn low, the air thickens with sweat, smoke, and the slight funk of things that should never have been cooked. You glance around. No one else looks concerned. A senator just fell asleep with half a fig in his mouth. Another is arguing that flamingos taste better in spring. You take a breath and try to rise, only to be pushed gently back by a slave holding a warm sponge on a stick, the Roman version of a napkin, or possibly a toilet paper prototype. You're not sure. You don't want to ask. Historians still wonder how Rome sustained such indulgence. Did they really feast like this every week? Or is this an exaggeration from ancient satirists like Juvenal and Petronius? Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, your stomach believes it. And then, just when you think it's over, someone uncovers a jelly made of fish bones and rose petals, glistening in the firelight. You close your eyes. You fake a smile. You pretend to be asleep, which is possibly the most Roman reaction of all. You would assume the worst is behind you, but alas, you're not in Rome anymore. You're in Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire. And if you thought flamingo brains were a tough swallow, just wait until you meet the local delicacies. Now, we move into a city built on lakes, connected by causeways, and fueled by marketplaces that sell everything from jaguar pelts to roasted salamanders. Yes, the Aztecs ate salamanders. Also frogs, lizards, and water insects lovingly known as ahuautla, a sort of bug caviar. Crunchy on the outside, existential on the inside. Your host is a noble priest, and you are somehow the guest of honor at a ritual feast. First course tamales. But not the kind you'd expect. These are stuffed with turkey, rabbit, or sometimes amaranth dough, mixed with human blood, depending on the time of year and the mood of the gods. Historians still argue whether the blood was real or symbolic, though colonial accounts insist it was quite literal. A sweet dish follows chocolate, with chili and maize flour, served warm and bitter. This is not a candy bar moment. This is a punch in the taste buds from a divine beverage meant to awaken your spirit and possibly your digestive regrets. The cacao was sacred, so you sip with trembling reverence and mild nausea. Then come the axolotls. Yes, the cute little smiley amphibians you've seen on stickers. Those were once pan-fried delicacies in Aztec cuisine. Crunchy legs, soft middle. A flavor described by one Spanish monk as like fish, but more guilt-inducing. Even the gods probably winced. Mainstream fact time, the Aztec diet was surprisingly balanced beans, maize, squash, tomatoes, and even spirulina algae from the lake. It wasn't all horror shows. In fact, the nobles were healthier than many European elites. But of course, they also threw in tuna cactus paddles, grasshoppers toasted with lime, and steamed ant eggs for variety and texture. The quirky fringe dish, stone-ground wasp larvae cakes. That's right, someone out there had to collect wasp babies, mash them into a paste, and then cook them into crispy medallions. It's protein-rich. It's crunchy. It's the stuff of bedtime culinary nightmares. Your neighbor eats it with delight and asks if you'd like another. You smile. You nod. You die a little inside. The priest then passes you a drink made of fermented corn spit. Yes, chicha, a traditional drink where women chew maize, spit it out, and let it ferment into beer. Microbes love saliva. And apparently, so did the gods. You sip politely, mentally scream, and pretend to admire the architecture. Historians still debate how much of this was common fare versus ceremonial excess. Were salamanders eaten by everyone, or just by the elite? Was blood food symbolic or literal? Is it worse to chew corn for the gods, or flambe dormice for senators? You're not sure. But as night falls over the great city and the fires flicker across canals, you begin to miss the simplicity of stale barley bread and spoiled garum. Rome was bad. This is a new frontier, and yet you feel oddly nourished. Maybe it's the corn beer. Maybe it's shock. Maybe it's knowing you've survived both Rome and the Aztec Empire, and your stomach hasn't surrendered. Yet. The sky over Tenochtitlan bruises into a violet haze. Temple drums thud softly in the distance like a tired heartbeat. And you lucky traveler of historical indigestion are invited to one final experience. Not a feast this time. A reflection. A slow walk back through all that your stomach and your sense of dignity have endured. You stand beside a canal, watching the reflection of torchlight shimmer like hot grease. Somewhere behind you, the remains of your last meal, axolotl and wasp cake combo, are negotiating with your intestines like two diplomats trying to avoid open conflict. Now, we drift into the quiet part of the night, where sensory overload gives way to uneasy wonder. You marvel at how every culture, from the marble halls of Rome to the floating gardens of the Aztecs, has taken food and wrapped it in ceremony, absurdity, and sometimes raw terror. It's not just nourishment, it's identity, hierarchy, punishment, and celebration all in one greasy bite. Historians still argue whether people truly enjoyed these extremes of cuisine or merely endured them for the sake of social standing or worse. Divine appeasement. Were flamingo tongues delicious? Was human blood tamale a source of genuine pride? Did anyone ever actually crave fermented spit beer? But the more pressing question is, what will they say about our food centuries from now? Microwave burritos, chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs, that terrifying green gelatin your aunt still insists on serving every holiday. Some future historian might mutter, "Did they really eat this?" On purpose, you chuckle quietly, because somewhere deep down, you realize that all food, however grotesque, is a mirror of the time, the tools, and the beliefs of its people. Romans gilded everything, even their appetizers. Aztecs offered their gods a taste of what they themselves cherished. And we Uber eats a cheese-filled crust with extra garlic butter and pretend it's culture. Quirky tidbit. For the road, the Aztecs reportedly bred turkeys, not just for food, but also for entertainment, training them to sing, dance, and accompany music at parties. Imagine eating your karaoke partner after he nails the third verse. And that's how the story ends. Not with a bang, but with a burp and a polite nod across civilizations. Now, your mind begins to slow. Your eyelids drag downward like heavy stone doors. The distant drums fade, replaced by a faint breeze and the soft lapping of water against stone. You are no longer a Roman guest of excess, no longer a reluctant Aztec diner with a bowl of ants in your lap. You are a sleepy traveler, curled beneath a sky full of ancient whispers and greasy regrets. Let the absurdity settle. Let your breath match the rhythm of 1,000 forgotten kitchens. And know this, no matter what century you were born into, dinner was always a bit of a gamble. Sleep well. Historian, you've earned it.